The silence was the worst kind of scream, high-pitched and internal, vibrating behind Sergeant Rourke's eyes. He had been staring at the same fist-sized patch of emerald moss clinging to the mahogany trunk for 47 minutes, timing his breaths by the slow drip of stagnant water condensing from the triple canopy above. The air here, deep within the An Lão Valley, wasn't just humid. It was pressurized, thick, carrying the smell of copper, wet rot, and the faint metallic scent of ozone that always clung to heavy electrical storms, even when the sky was clear. This was the fifth day Phantom 4 men and a radio, had been strung out along the invisible thread of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, tasked with confirming the existence of a major supply staging area that intelligence promised was brimming with AK-47 crates and B-40 rockets. Rourke knew, with the cold certainty that only isolation and instinct can deliver, that the intelligence was garbage, that the jungle was lying to them. It was too quiet. The usual cacophony, the insistent drone of cicadas, the territorial screeches of monkeys, the rustle of foraging animals, had been replaced by a heavy, suffocating blanket of green quietude that implied a far larger, far more organized presence nearby that was actively suppressing all noise. Rourke shifted his weight infinitesimally, the movement causing the heavy canvas web gear to groan a complaint against the slick nylon of his shirt. He ran his tongue over his dry lips. They felt like sandpaper. He didn't dare take a drink yet. Water discipline was the last bastion of control in a place where control was an illusion. His fingers tightened around the worn pistol grip of his M16, the plastic slick with sweat and the residue of DEET. He looked over the sight picture, blurring his focus slightly to take in the texture of the surrounding foliage. Every shadow was a shape. Every broken vine was a signpost. They were ghosts hunting a ghost, 30 clicks past the last known friendly line, and the only thing tethering him to reality was the faint, rhythmic scratching sound coming from 10 feet to his left. Doc checking his sterile needle packs. Doc, barely 20, was the youngest but carried the heaviest burden, the literal weight of life and death strapped to his back, a medic kit that felt like a sack of bricks filled with failure. Rourke looked at the wrist compass. 14:15. 15 minutes until they were supposed to move to the final coordinates. 15 minutes of silent, searing paranoia. He closed his eyes for a single count, letting the blackness consume the green, and whispered the only prayer he ever bothered with anymore. Just let us see tomorrow's sunrise. The movement commenced in increments, a slow, agonizing crawl through the undergrowth that demanded supreme focus on the placement of every boot heel, every knee, every weapon muzzle. Doc followed Rourke, his attention split between scanning the trail ahead for tripwires and managing the internal debate that raged constantly within his mind. The philosophical absurdity of treating wounds caused by ideology he barely understood. He was a history student pulled from a warm library and plunged into this sweltering, unforgiving morass. He found the irony almost unbearable, yet he executed his task flawlessly, the heavy rucksack of medical supplies a constant, chafing reminder of his purpose. The sun rarely pierced the canopy here. They moved in a perpetual twilight, the air thick with airborne spores and the sickening sweetness of blooming jungle orchids, which always seemed to thrive near the most dangerous parts of the trail. The humidity made the optical clarity worse, coating everything in a shimmering, hazy sheen. Doc wiped his face with the back of a hand that was permanently stained with mud and insect repellent. He caught a glimpse of Switch, the RTO, bringing up the third position, looking frantic even when stationary. Switch had the high-strung energy of a hummingbird, constantly worried about the performance of his PRC-77 radio, their only lifeline and a magnet for enemy attention. Switch's nervousness was infectious, a low-grade hum in the unit's psyche. But Rourke kept him focused, always giving him small, specific tasks to prevent the anxiety from spiraling. They crossed a small, muddy stream that smelled distinctly of diesel, a worrying sign. Diesel meant mechanized transport, and mechanized transport meant supply lines were active, just not where the brass expected them to be. As Rourke stepped onto the far bank, he paused, his body rigid. He hadn't stopped because of a sound. He stopped because of a lack of a sound. He raised a closed fist, stopping the patrol. He dropped to one knee, ignoring the leech that instantly fastened onto his damp trousers. He pointed toward a cluster of high ferns, then traced a line downward with his finger. Doc craned his neck, squinting. It was a single, freshly snapped stalk, not broken by an animal, but by something heavy and deliberate. More critically, resting on the damp earth next to the snapped foliage was a piece of white lint. Not jungle cotton, but fine, spun cloth, the kind used for inexpensive European cigarettes. Definitely not something indigenous or locally procured. It was a fleeting, tiny clue, meaningless to the untrained eye, but Rourke knew exactly what it meant. A momentary lack of discipline by someone who thought they were deep enough to be safe. They were not chasing ghosts. They had stumbled onto something much worse than a supply cache. They had found the trail of men. Specialist Hayes, trailing the formation in the fourth position, moved like an apparition, his body language communicating utter contempt for their mission. Hayes was the cynic, the man who had seen too many patrols end in bloodshed over intelligence reports written on cocktail napkins back in Saigon. He carried the Stoner 63 light machine gun, a beast of a weapon that he treated with a strange mix of adoration and resentment. It was heavy, complex, and prone to jamming, but when it worked, it was a beautiful, devastating instrument of destruction. Hayes hadn't spoken more than 10 words in 2 days, communicating solely through subtle hand signals that were clearer than any briefing. He despised the heat, the incompetence, and above all, the futility of their task. Every step was a calculated risk against an unseen enemy for an unknown prize. They had been promised a major score, a chance to truly disrupt NVA logistics. But the reality was endless, exhausting tracking through terrain that actively tried to swallow them whole. Hayes' shoulders ached constantly from the weight of the Stoner and the spare ammo boxes. He calculated the total weight at nearly 80 pounds. He moved purely on muscle memory and caffeine pills, fueled by the conviction that if he stopped, the jungle would claim him immediately. He saw Rourke freeze and immediately adopted a low, 3-point defensive crouch, the Stoner resting lightly on the crook of his elbow, ready to fire in a half second. He didn't need to be told what Rourke saw. He felt the shift in pressure, the subtle tightening in the atmosphere that signaled proximity to the enemy. Hayes watched Doc confirm the sighting and felt a familiar, cold spike of adrenaline, the only true drug left in this war. Hayes thought about the coordinates they were headed toward. The map grid indicated a small, flat rise bordered by a horseshoe-shaped stream, perfect for a cache. Yet the ground under their boots was starting to slope sharply downward, away from the predicted rise, and the geology felt wrong. Hayes leaned closer to the dense wall of elephant grass, his senses heightened. He heard the faint, nearly undetectable scrape of metal on stone, a sound far too heavy to be a monkey or a small rodent. It was the sound of a shovel, barely audible over the rush of blood in his own ears. They were definitely close, but they weren't approaching a dead cache. They were approaching a live work site. Hayes silently tapped the shoulder switch ahead of him, holding up 2 fingers, 2 known contacts, meaning Rourke and document. He added a 3rd finger, tapping his own chest, meaning wait for the others. He needed a clear line of fire if this went sideways. The realization of the true situation, that they were walking into a functioning, defended enemy staging area, not a quiet warehouse, hit Hayes with brutal clarity. The intel was wrong, catastrophically so. They were about to step onto a hornet's nest, and the hornets were home. The coordinates were reached, not with a sense of accomplishment, but with the cold, sinking dread of confirmation. There was no supply cache. There was no cleared area, just more jungle, denser than ever, marked by giant, spiked euphorbia vines and a sickly yellow soil that suggested poor drainage and deep erosion. Rourke knelt beside the GPS reading, checking it twice against the map overlay, the lines of latitude and longitude mocking him. This was the end of the line, the final objective, and it was a lie. He signaled the unit to form a tight, defensive perimeter, their backs against the confusing, unforgiving tangle of the undergrowth. They had wasted 5 days and burned through half their rations chasing a phantom. The true cost, however, wasn't the supplies, it was the psychological expenditure, the slow erosion of faith in the mission itself. Rourke looked at Switch, who was already meticulously checking the antenna connection on the radio, his face pale beneath the grime. He knew what Rourke was thinking. Should we call this in? Report the failure? Or should they press on against all directives? Because the diesel smell and the broken ferns suggested the NVA presence was close, just shifted 10 degrees east. Autre chose silence. Reporting the bad intel would mean extraction, and extraction meant admitting they had risked their lives for nothing but bureaucratic incompetence. That was a debt Rourke wasn't ready to pay yet. He pulled out the canteen and allowed himself a controlled sip, letting the lukewarm water cut through the cotton mouth. He spent 5 minutes staring at the map, folding and unfolding it until the creases were white and frayed. The true staging area had to be adjacent, utilizing the natural concealment of the stream they had crossed. He decided they would execute a wide, silent loop back toward the stream, following the faint scent of diesel. They would spend the next 2 hours confirming the NVA presence, then call in the coordinates for an arc light B-52 strike, turning the entire valley into glass. That thought, the idea of wiping the map clean with high explosives, was the only comfort he had left. He gave the hand signal for a slow, cautious withdrawal, moving off the objective site and into virgin jungle. The shift in direction was subtle, but immediately unnerving. They were no longer following a known path. They were venturing into the completely unknown, guided only by the ghost of a fuel smell. As they began the loop, Switch whispered, his voice dry, "Sarge, I smell it again. Wood smoke. Fresh." Rourke nodded. Wood smoke in this humidity carried far, but it meant a fire was recently lit, meaning men were resting, cooking, or preparing to move. They were walking straight toward the heart of the enemy, operating solely on the instinct that the truth was worth the danger. Rourke drew his combat knife, reversing the grip. It was time to stop observing and start confirming. The silence that had plagued them for days was about to be broken, not by the jungle's natural life, but by the violence of man. The contact came without warning, an explosion that erased all prior sensory experience and replaced it with a roaring, high-frequency pitch. It wasn't the distant whump of mortar fire. It was a close-quarters detonation, the sound of earth being torn violently apart less than 20 feet away. Switch, moving slightly too fast in the rear middle position, had stepped directly onto a tripwire attached to a buried 105mm artillery shell, rigged as an improvised mine. The shell didn't fully detonate, thank God, but the charge ripped through the ground, throwing Switch violently sideways into a thick stand of razor grass, scattering his equipment like confetti and leaving him screaming in a sound that was instantly recognizable as pure, unadulterated pain. The jungle erupted instantly. The suppressed silence was shattered by a deafening symphony of automatic fire. Rourke reacted first, dropping instantly and simultaneously spraying a tight burst from his M16 toward the flashpoints that immediately appeared along the crest of a nearby, unseen bunker line. He didn't aim. He simply directed fire to suppress the enemy long enough to assess the damage. Tracers, green, sickly light, stitched the air inches above his helmet, tearing through the foliage and showering the team with splintered wood and dirt. Hayes immediately pivoted, dropping the bipod of the stoner and unleashing a long, sustained roar of 7.6 2mm fire. The stoner, finally unleashed, sounded like a giant tearing canvas, a heavier, more authoritative sound than the enemy's AKs. Hayes targeted the highest concentration of muzzle flashes, carving deep swaths through the NVA line, buying precious seconds. Doc, despite the overwhelming noise and danger, was already crawling towards Switch's crumpled body, his medical bag sliding across the wet dirt. Switch was conscious, screaming, holding his right leg, which was twisted at a grotesque angle. Shrapnel had shredded his trousers, and the blood was already blooming darkly into the soil. The radio lay on its side, the antenna bent and sparking faintly, utterly useless. The air was heavy with the smell of burnt gunpowder and fresh blood, a sickening, primal mix. Rourke shouted over the din, the sound barely audible even to himself. "Hayes, cover fire! Doc, get him stabilized. We're breaking contact left now." The 15-minute clock had started. They were pinned by overwhelming fire with a casualty, and their primary means of communication was destroyed. It was a textbook ambush, executed with brutal precision, proving that the wood smoke was a beacon leading them directly into a pre-established kill zone. This wasn't a skirmish. This was a desperate race for survival. They had walked into a fortified position designed to swallow an entire company, and Phantom 4 was barely a snack. As the adrenaline surged, Rourke thought about the irony. 5 days of terrifying silence, now replaced by 15 minutes of world-ending noise, all because of a fabricated intelligence report. He glanced quickly at the faces of his men. Doc, grim and focused on his work, sweat pouring down his temples. Hayes, a mask of cold fury as he fed belt after belt into the stoner. They were heroes now, executing their roles perfectly, but Rourke knew the aftermath would bring the crushing weight of disillusionment. How much can a soldier endure before the fight for survival stops being about duty and starts becoming purely personal? Before the sheer exhaustion and futility break the spirit? If you've ever felt that kind of exhaustion, that weight of fighting for something that feels meaningless, share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk about the true cost of these silent, hidden battles. Doc worked in a state of hyper-focused dissociation, the training taking over completely. The high-pitched scream of automatic fire became background static. The only reality was the sickening crunch of Switch's fractured tibia and the arterial spurt from a nasty shrapnel wound near his groin. The pressure of the enemy fire was relentless. The NVA were pouring volley after volley onto their position, attempting to capitalize on the momentary paralysis caused by the blast. Doc had to work fast, securing a tourniquet high on the thigh, his hands slick with sweat and blood. He injected Switch with morphine, praying the shock hadn't already taken hold. He could feel the vibration of the ground beneath him from Hayes' stoner, the weapon operating as a protective cocoon of noise and lead. The heat generated by the M60 rounds was incredible, causing the vegetation around Hayes to steam and wilt. Rourke was maneuvering slightly ahead, using short, controlled bursts to keep the NVA from rushing their position. He was prioritizing fire efficiency, knowing they couldn't afford to run dry on ammunition while pinned down. Every single round fired felt like an irreversible decision. The enemy fire was coming from at least 3 different directions now, suggesting they were partially surrounded, utilizing the dense undergrowth and subterranean positions the map had failed to disclose. Doc finished the rough stabilization, tossing a fresh field dressing over the shrapnel wound. Switch was still whimpering, but the morphine was starting to dull the worst of the pain, replacing the screams with guttural moans. "Sarge, he's stable, but we gotta move him. He can't walk," Doc yelled, trying to rise. Rourke spun, his face smeared with camouflage paint and dirt, his eyes wide and blazing with adrenaline. "Switch, ditch everything but your pistol. Doc, you and Hayes drag him, I'll cover." Rourke emptied half a magazine into a suspected firing port nestled between 2 giant bamboo stalks, causing the muzzle flash to vanish temporarily. Hayes ceased fire long enough to sling the heavy stoner over his back, grabbing Switch by the shoulder webbing, while Doc took the legs. The movement was agonizingly slow. The weight of Switch, combined with the uneven terrain, made every inch a monumental struggle. They were moving laterally, attempting to breach the left flank of the ambush and escape into the less dense jungle, sacrificing direct retreat for sheer survival distance. Rourke provided the soundtrack for their escape, the M16 barking fiercely, throwing counterfire whenever the NVA aggression peaked. They were leaving a trail of crushed ferns, spent brass, and Switch's blood, but that was a problem for later. For now, The only objective was to survive the next 60 seconds. Hayes, despite the cumbersome weight of the stoner on his back, pulled Switch's weight with primal strength, fueled by a furious, cold determination. He didn't think about the pain in his own muscles. He focused solely on the geometry of the ground and the rhythmic pull of Doc next to him. The enemy recognized their move and shifted their focus, concentrating fire on the retreating line. Hayes felt the sting of hot shrapnel tearing across his left flank. Not enough to stop him, but enough to make the blood well up quickly, soaking the canvas of his pack. He didn't cry out. He simply tightened his jaw and pulled harder. Rourke was a whirlwind of controlled violence, popping a smoke grenade, purple phosphorus thick and obscuring, and immediately diving for cover behind a massive root-knotted embankment. The smoke spread quickly, choking the kill zone in an acrid haze that temporarily blinded the NVA machine gunners. This was their window. Hayes and Doc lunged forward, dragging Switch like a sack of sand, using the cover provided by the chemical screen. The NVA fire became wilder, less accurate, but still terrifyingly close. Hayes reached the embankment, pulling Doc and Switch behind the relative safety of the roots. They collapsed, gasping for breath, the purple smoke stinging their eyes and lungs. Rourke slid in beside them, checking his ammunition reserves. He had 3 full magazines left and 2 partials. He tossed a fresh magazine to Hayes, who immediately slammed a home into the stoner. "How bad?" Rourke gasped, gesturing at Switch. "Legs broken, fragmentation wounds, massive blood loss. He needs a real evac, Rourke." Now, Doc's voice was tight, betraying the exhaustion he was masking. Rourke looked at the useless, smoking wreckage of the radio 10 yards back, swallowed by the settling smoke. There would be no communication, no air support, and no extraction until they could reach a safe LZ and repair the primary unit or activate the secondary emergency beacon, a task that required them to be outside the immediate kill zone. They had broken contact, but the NVA were still there, waiting for the smoke to dissipate. The short, sharp intensity of the 15-minute fight was transitioning back into the silent, grinding terror of the stalk. Rourke knew they only had a few moments before the enemy started probing the smokescreen. He looked at Hayes, his eyes communicating the new, desperate plan. They had to move faster, ditching more gear if necessary, and they had to hold off the pursuit until they found high ground suitable for a repair and a signal. Hayes simply nodded, re-shouldering the heavy machine gun, the shrapnel wound a pulsing throb beneath the weight. They were moving out again, wounded and blind, deeper into the jungle, driven only by the terrifying efficiency of their training and the absolute necessity of keeping Switch alive. The retreat was an agony of noise suppression and physical effort. Every 30 feet, they had to stop, scan, listen, and then resume the exhausting drag of Switch. Rourke maintained a wide, circular arc, trying to confuse any trackers while still attempting to head toward higher, theoretically safer ground. The jungle here was a treacherous labyrinth of thorn bushes and submerged roots, making the progress painfully slow. Hayes began to hemorrhage slightly more quickly than he anticipated from the shrapnel wound, and the exhaustion magnified the pain. He focused on the immediate task, lifting, pulling, moving. Doc had exhausted his field dressings on Switch and was now meticulously conserving the rest of his medical gear, knowing that if any of them were hit again, their chances dropped exponentially. Rourke noticed the blood trail they were leaving, dark and conspicuous against the paler mud. It was a beacon. He stopped the patrol abruptly, signaling silent defense. He pulled out the last 2 claymore mines they carried, setting them up at chest height along the 2 most likely approach vectors, creating a makeshift, silent rearguard. He threaded the detonation wires back toward their position, clipping them to the small electrotrigger box. He knew these mines wouldn't stop an entire NVA company, but they would cause enough confusion and delay to buy them a critical 10 minutes. The smell of wood smoke had intensified again, confirming that the NVA were indeed tracking them, probably with a dedicated hunter-killer team. Rourke signaled for the group to ditch their rucksacks, everything except the ammunition, water, basic medical supplies, and the broken radio unit. The act of abandoning their survival gear, maps, spare batteries, field rations, felt like a desperate concession to the jungle. But they couldn't afford the wait. Hayes reluctantly dropped the specialized ammunition pack for the stoner, keeping only the belts loaded into the weapon. Doc detached his massive medic rucksack, transferring only the most critical 4 fluids and trauma shears to his webbing. The relief of shedding the weight was immediate, allowing them to move at a slightly faster, albeit still desperate pace. As they moved on, Rourke activated the safety on the Claymore trigger and glanced back at the abandoned packs, already being swallowed by the aggressive green growth. He felt the cold realization settle over him. They had just burned everything they needed for sustained survival for a 15-minute firefight that achieved absolutely nothing but inflicting casualties on their own team. Hours blurred into a single, humid nightmare. They had achieved a slight elevation, enough to afford a panoramic, terrifying view of the green hell they had just escaped. The jungle canopy was so dense that it looked like a gigantic, rolling green cauliflower field, unbroken by any sign of civilization or rescue. The only sign of the recent violence was the distant, faint sound of small arms fire, indicating the NVA were still clearing the original ambush site. They found a small, semi-protected depression behind a cluster of limestone rocks, offering temporary cover. Rourke finally allowed a proper rest, placing Hayes on watch. Doc immediately began a more thorough examination of Switch. The morphine was wearing off, and Switch was shivering violently, slipping into hypothermia despite the sweltering heat, a sure sign of shock and internal trauma. Doc needed to get N4 started immediately, a difficult task in the low light and under the threat of renewed contact. Rourke took the damaged PRC-77 from the pile of salvage gear. The antenna housing was shattered, the power cable frayed, and the main transceiver body was cracked. It was a mess. Rourke, the least technical member of the team, knelt beside the wreckage, pulling out the small repair kit that was mandatory in every LRRP kit. He needed to bridge the broken connections, but the required micro-soldering was impossible here. He looked at the cracked frame, realizing the damage was probably beyond their capability. Their emergency beacon, a tiny, one-use device, was located in the abandoned rucksacks. They were truly alone now, cut off from the world, with a severely wounded man and a broken radio. Rourke felt the immense weight of command crush down on him. Every mistake, every misjudgment, every single unnecessary risk taken in the past 5 days culminated in this desolate moment. He looked at Doc, carefully inserting the needle into Switch's vein, the fluid bag dangling from a broken branch. "Doc," Rourke said, his voice raw, "how long does he have?" Without full medical care. Doc didn't look up, his brow furrowed with intense concentration. 24 hours, maybe less if the infection sets in. "Sarge, we need to move, and we need to signal. We can't drag him another 10 clicks." Rourke looked at Hayes, who was hunched over the stoner, his eyes fixed on the tree-line, his face etched with grim resignation. The fight had been brutal, yes, but the hours immediately following were proving to be the real killer. The slow, grinding psychological attrition that bled them dry of hope. Rourke pulled the satellite map from his trousers, his last, best piece of equipment, searching desperately for a natural break in the canopy. A clearing, a riverbed, anything that could serve as a visual marker for an observation plane, or, God willing, an extraction. Rourke located a possibility. 3 kilometers west, nestled in a deep fold of the foothills, was an area marked on the map as Rocky Spillway, a wide, dry riverbed that, crucially, was exposed to the sky. It was a perilous journey, forcing them to move horizontally across the grain of the enemy's likely staging area, but it was their only chance for visual confirmation or air extraction. He broke the silence, his voice low and firm. "Rocky Spillway. 3 clicks. We move at first light. We need to lighten the load even more." Hayes nodded, already discarding the heavier toolkit and spare rations. Doc protested, "Rourke, we need the energy. We need the food. We need the speed." Document. "If we stay here, they find us. If we move fast, we might beat them, to the LZ. The decision was made. They spent the remainder of the night in anxious, broken shifts, the jungle sounds returning slowly now, no longer the oppressive silence, but 1,000 small, scratching, rustling noises that all sounded like approaching boots. The taste of fear was copper and bile. Rourke watched the stars pierce the canopy openings, marking the slow passage of time. He thought of the intelligence officer who sent them out here, some clean-shaven major in an air-conditioned office in Da Nang, drawing lines on a map, oblivious to the fact that his pencil marks had nearly cost 4 lives. The 15-minute fight now felt less like a desperate survival effort and more like a cruel, senseless joke. They had killed men, watched a friend severely wounded, and destroyed their communication, all for a non-existent target. The sheer, crushing futility of it settled deep into Rourke's gut. Hayes, sitting next to him, shifted and spoke, his voice barely a rasp. "Sarge, when we get out of this, I'm done. I'm putting in for transfer. Supply depot, anything." It wasn't a question or a request, just a statement of fact, the final shred of his dedication snapped by the absurdity of the mission. Rourke just nodded. He understood. This war wasn't about winning territory. It was about surviving the next 24 hours, and sometimes, even that felt like too high a price for a war fought over rumors and faulty map coordinates. He checked the firing leads to the Claymore again, just to be sure. He knew, deep down, that they were only moving because the alternatives were unthinkable. The fight had only lasted 15 minutes, but the price would last a lifetime. Dawn began to smear the sky with gray light, washing out the stars and revealing the oppressive green of the jungle one more time. Time to move. Time to gamble everything on 3 kilometers of treacherous ground and a dry riverbed.